This is ILM Circle, a learning workshop presented by the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, or ISBA. ILM stands for Intentional Learning for Mutual Respect, the foundation of what ISBA is all about.
Welcome. My name is Michelle Marion, and I am one of the volunteers for the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, and I'm really excited to welcome everyone to tonight's presentation on process Christology. Couple of little announcements before I introduce our esteemed guest speaker. On Monday, February 24th, the Youth Interfaith Iftar is occurring beginning at 4:45 p.m. at the Islamic Center of the Northeast Valley. And then also, a little further out in April, there is a ladies' tea that will be on April the 6th, and we'll have more details for you. I'll put those in the chat as far as registration spaces and then more information about that. So it is my pleasure to welcome Reverend Dr. J.R. Hartley as our guest speaker for tonight's presentation on process Christology. Reverend Dr. Hartley is the regional minister and president of the Christian Church, the Disciples of Christ in Arizona. Dr. Hartley earned the Master's of Divinity degree from Vanderbilt Divinity School, where he studied process theology with Marjorie Suhaki and Christology with Sally McFagg, leading to the development of his process Christology, the topic of our presentation tonight. Dr. Hartley also earned degrees as a Doctor of Ministry from Lexington Theological Seminary, Masters of Music Performance in the Bassoon from the University of Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music, and a bachelor's degree in liberal arts with a focus on religion and music from Williams College in Massachusetts. Reverend Dr. Hartley loves to play the bagpipes, read novels, and hike the beautiful mountains of Arizona. And we welcome Dr. Hartley tonight. If you have questions throughout his presentation, please put them in the chat, and then I will moderate those after his presentation, and we'll have ample time to address those. So welcome, Dr. Hartley.
Thank you, and thank you everybody for inviting me. I'm going to do some background things to help lay the groundwork. I grew up in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, which is a fairly progressive and open-minded denomination. We do not have a creed. We do not have a book of discipline. We don't have any set of words that we have to say that we agree with to be disciples of Christ. It was meant to be a kind of a uniting movement to say anybody that wants to follow Jesus is invited to be part of our church, and we're encouraged to think for ourselves, to study scripture and dialogue with people, and to come to whatever conclusions make sense to us. So, and we're taught, from childhood, don't just say you believe something because you were told to believe it. Learn to articulate what you believe and learn your whole life through. So that's my background, and that's how I approach the world and everybody. So anything I say tonight is about my journey of faith and what has made sense to me, and by no means do I try to speak for all of Christianity, or do I want to tell anybody else what's right or what they have to believe. I hope that makes sense. Next, there was a part of me growing up that felt called to be a minister, but I believed that a minister had to believe that Jesus was the only way to salvation, and that Jesus was the only way, and if you didn't believe in Jesus, you were not, going to heaven. I thought that a Christian minister had to believe that, and I didn't believe that. So I kept going to church, I kept singing hymns, but I never decided I wanted to be a minister, because I thought ministers were supposed to believe that, and I didn't want to get up in the pulpit and be a hypocrite. and say something that I didn't believe. So I found myself in my third year at Vanderbilt Divinity School. Still, when people said, "Oh, are you going to be a minister?" I was like, "No, absolutely no desire to do that," because I still thought that that was Orthodox Christianity and that's what you had to teach if you were a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in this one semester, I had these two classes from these two amazing women theologians, Sally McFaig and Marjorie Suhaki, and the convergence of those just transformed my life and helped me develop what I felt was an intellectually credible and biblically valid interpretation of Jesus that was not exclusive. And that's what I call my process Christology. Um, Process theology is really complex with a whole lot of terminology, and I would read Marjorie Suhaki's book, and then every single page I probably read 4 times before I thought I had an idea what she was talking about. So anything I say about process Christology will be very simplified and probably not exactly right because it's only at the level that I was able to understand it and put it in words that worked for me. But again, like I was starting from the big problem was how do you believe in Jesus? How do you follow Jesus and not be exclusive? I was not willing to condemn my Jewish friends or my atheist friends because they didn't believe in Jesus. What does believing in Jesus even mean? Like to me, it's not about believing and it's about following. But so that's the fundamental problem that I was dealing with. And so my understanding of process theology was started by Alfred North Whitehead, who is kind of a scientist, and then it kind of merged from process philosophy into process theology with John Cobb and Charles Hartshorne, and then Marjorie Suhaki. So she's one of the kind of foremost writers and teachers in process theology, and it's the idea that God is always in the process of creation. That it's not like God created and then stepped back and let the world run. It's that whatever you call God and whatever you consider to be the creation of the earth is a constant process. Every second is being recreated. And it's recreated based on what already is and what God's will is. With the idea that what already is probably going to be a lot like what happens a minute from now. But if you mix in God's will, it might change a little bit. It might change a little bit for the better. And so they have this term for God's will called the initial aim. And that is like God's initial aim, God's desire, God's will, God's hope for what happens next. And then there's kind of what we choose to do. And so the simplified version of the way it makes sense to me, and Marjorie kind of gave me this metaphor for the most part, is it's kind of like if you want to picture God up in the sky with a bow and arrow, shooting little arrows down into all of our brains, kind of saying, do this or do this, or into our hearts, leading us to care for somebody. But for the most part, on the back of our head, we have like a metal shield, and most of those little arrows bounce off. So God is constantly trying to communicate with us, and we are mostly just missing the point the vast majority of the time. Those arrows bounce off our shields. Occasionally they get through. Occasionally you're aware that they get through, right? You have one of those aha moments where you get something of clarity, and maybe that's like actually you opened yourself up to what God was trying to tell you all along, and suddenly it made sense, and suddenly you got it, and your life changed in that. But Margie would say the vast majority of those little arrows just bounce off of us. Very few get through. There are things that we can do to try to make that membrane, that shield, more porous. So if we engage in spiritual disciplines, prayer, fasting, meditation, with luck, we're softening that membrane on the back of our heads, and it's a little easier for God's instructions to get through. Um, and that this process works for everybody. And so she sees people that were major spiritual figures in the history of the world as having remarkably porous membranes. So Jesus, for instance, might have had almost no shield at all, and everything that God was trying to lead Jesus to do got through. And so to talk about Jesus as being God in the flesh is kind of like Jesus was so open to the will of God. Jesus was a human being just like you and me, but was so open, so much more open than we are, that it was like what God would be like as a human being. But that leaves room for the Buddha. I mean, say Jesus let 99% of them get through, right? There's a story in the Bible about him calling a woman a dog. Not a nice thing to call a woman. That might have been one of those times that Jesus kind of missed it, but she pushed back on him a little bit, and then he opened up, right? So, maybe that was one that didn't get through. I am not threatened by thinking of Jesus as being imperfect from time to time, not in tune with the will of God from time to time, but still say he was so remarkably in tune with God's will that he's someone for me to follow and model my life after and try to follow in his footsteps. But say like for a Christian, we want to say 99.99% of God's arrows got through to Jesus's heart and Jesus's mind. We could say, well, 80% of them got through to the Buddha. Now, I'm not trying to be competitive. These are just hypothetical numbers, right? But 35% got through to Martin Luther King Jr., right? And so he was such an amazing spiritual leader for us. Still very imperfect, but more open to God's will than the majority of people in his day, significantly so to be a teacher. But it leaves room for the Buddha, leaves room for Muhammad. The idea is that God is always working to make the world better, that God is always trying to send love and help us learn to love and act with compassion, and is always seeking, the well-being of all people. And everything that God does is towards those aims, and God has done that since the first moment of creation, and God continues to do it in every single moment of creation. To say that God only tried to save humanity one time, has always struck me as like, what a sad God that would be. Oh, well, I tried once, you didn't listen, you know. But if God is trying all the time through all the prophets, through all the spiritual leaders of whatever culture, that makes sense to me that God would try. And so for a culture to latch on to one particular person and say, okay, we're going to follow Jesus, that's fine. But to then say nobody else can follow anybody else and everybody else is wrong strikes me as not fine and as insulting to God. So Jesus becomes I will often say a manifestation of God, as opposed to the manifestation of God. And if some Christian people want to say he's the best manifestation of God, like I don't need to fight with them, but I'm not going to like say, oh well, our manifestation of God is better than your manifestation of God. So when this all kind of clicked for me during those two classes, I felt like I can unabashedly, unapologetically follow Jesus and claim that Jesus is the pioneer and perfecter of my faith and has so much to offer the world without any need to feel like I'm being exclusive, and therefore without any need to feel like I'm being a hypocrite if I am not trying to convert my Jewish neighbor while I'm preaching Jesus. I did that a lot quicker than I did the last time I did this, and I could go into a lot more detail, but I can pause for a moment to see if there are any questions at this stage.
And please feel free to unmute if you'd like to do a question at this moment. And just be mindful, a minute or two for question or comment.
Hi, Jay.
Hi, Doug.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really appreciate the humility with which you presented. And I've not heard the metaphor of, the idea that God is shooting these arrows into us, and sometimes we have that shield. Most of the time, we have that shield up that prevents us from hearing and responding. And it's a good metaphor. I wonder if you would say something. One of the things I often hear from process theologians is the idea about the lure, and I wonder if you might comment about that.
Yeah, that is great because that leads right into what I was probably going to say next. I've got an analogy and I've got an example for how that works for me. So process theology talks about God's power as persuasive power, not coercive power, right? So coercive power makes things happen, and persuasive power invites things to happen. And as Doug said, the word they usually use is the lure, right? A lure, the invitation, the pull, the draw. And so one way I like to think about God, because that's where we start in process theology, is like, what is God? How do we conceive of God? And I like to think of God as a soccer coach for a 5-year-old soccer team. And if you've ever watched 5-year-olds play soccer, there's 11 on each team, and there's a ball here, and all 11 people are right there. I mean, all 20 people, like there's a goalie back, right? All 20 little kids are all in a big cluster, and the ball goes nowhere, and it's incredibly boring to watch, and it's incredibly ineffective. The coach has tried to teach them to spread out and to kick the ball out to the wing, but they're not doing it. The coach is shouting instructions from the sidelines like these arrows, right? Trying to, hey, Joey, kick it all out to the wing. Hey, Doug, run out to the wing and they'll kick you the ball and you'll have a free shot to the goal, right? But they're all clustered because they're the ones playing the game. The coach doesn't run on the game and kick the ball, right? God does not run in and kick the ball. God is kindly shouting instructions. And occasionally, a player will call timeout and everybody will go over to the coach and the coach will kind of try to draw it out and give instructions. And I think of this as times of prayer, and then maybe a couple of the kids get it and they spread out and it works better, but the coach never can go on the field. But the more the players are open to listening to what the coach says, the better things are going to go. So that's kind of my analogy of how God works with us. It is never running onto the field and doing something. It is not coercive power. It is persuasive power. It is trying to lure, hey, come over here. Right? So my example is one time when I was a youth minister, one of the moms in the church forwarded me this email, and this was back in late 2001 or early 2002, but I think late 2001. And it was a story about this man that was on something like the 113th floor of the World Trade Center. And he was in his office. He was a good Christian person. He looks up and the plane is flying right at his window. And he gets down on his knees and he prays to be Spirit. And at the last second, the plane turns like this, hits the floor above him, and he manages to get out safely. He tells his story, talks about how God saved him, and it goes haywire on the internet. And so this mom sent this to me. Isn't this wonderful? why don't you read this story to the kids in Sunday school? Well, personally, I didn't find it wonderful, but I did read the story to the kids in Sunday school, and then I asked them what they thought, right? Because we're disciples, so we invite people to think. And initially the kids said, "Oh, that's so amazing! Oh, that's so wonderful!" And I said, "I just have one question." And then I drew like the 113th floor and the 114th floor and the 112th floor on a sheet of paper, like on a map. And then I drew the plane coming in, and it's going to take out the 113th floor, and on the last second it tilts. I said, "So what does it say about God and the person that was right here in this office on the 112th floor, that because this guy prayed, they get taken out?" And the kids were like, "Oh." I'm like, were they not praying? Did God say, "Oh, I like this person better because they prayed and that person didn't better"? Is that how God works? And they were like, "Well, that doesn't seem like a very good God." I'm like, "Doesn't to me." So we ended up having a wonderful conversation about how God works with the world. You know, I said, if God had coercive power, why wouldn't God just reach a hand down, grab the airplane out of the sky, reach in, pull out the pilots, set them down, and, right in front of a couple police officers, set the plane down and let everybody else get off? If God had coercive power, why doesn't God do that? Because God wants to teach America a lesson? Because God didn't know it was happening? Because God doesn't care? Like, none of those answers were satisfying to me. So is God totally absent from a situation like that? And so in my understanding of process theology, it would be God is shooting arrows at that pilot saying, "Don't do this, don't do this. There's a better way. Don't kill so many people." And the pilot wasn't listening or refused to listen or whatever, but that God only works with the world through the power of persuasion, and we have the ability to totally ignore um, what God is saying to us. So that's a little bit of how it works. How the theory, how I apply it to like specific examples in life. Does that make sense? Did that help respond to your question, Doug?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Um, so Claremont is a center for process theology, and there are Christians there. There are also other faith traditions represented. So, are there, say a little bit about Jewish or Buddhist or Islamic process theologians or thinkers?
I will have to say very, 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 very little about that because I don't know anything. I know that process theology started as process philosophy, right? So it didn't necessarily start in a Christian world. So theoretically, there could be Muslim process theologians and Jewish process theologians, but I have not encountered that in my life, so I don't know anything.
Hmm.
Do any of you?
I think there is a group of interfaith process theologians that I at one point used to observe, and so there were process Muslims and process Jews, but that's all I can tell you is that they do exist.
Mhm.
I would say the way you're describing it is we believe in free will, that God has given us free will. And that kind of sounds like what you're saying. We have choices.
Yeah, and for me, the question is, did God give us free will and God could take it back, or God had other choices? Or is it that, free will is just the way the world is, and that whatever we call God, works with the way the world is? Theoretically, if God, depending on your understanding of God, God could have created the world differently. But that's going back so far that I think it's probably above all of our pay grades. The
Shouldn't be.
and there are, and so this is why, I was saying to Ezra and Michelle beforehand, like if there's any fundamentalist Christians on the call, we might get argument. The notion that God is not all in control, that God does not make everything happen. Um, that's a version of God that some people can't take. For me, it's the only kind that really makes sense with what I experience. It's the only thing that makes sense with suffering, because if God is all loving, and if God is all knowing, and if God is all powerful in a coercive way, why does the Holocaust happen? You know, I don't see any way to explain that. You have to get rid of one of those three. And Rabbi Kushner, in his book, when bad things happen to good people, he got rid of the all powerful. And so what process theologians are saying is we don't believe in an all coercively powerful God, but in a God whose power is persuasive power, and it works when we work with it. It lures us to it. And like little example, right? I was counseling church camp this weekend, um, and the first night there was some, believe it or not, disrespectful behavior from some of the teenagers. We had 75 teenagers packed into a room that was big enough to sit 75 teenagers on the floor. So we were packed. And the keynote speaker tried to do 1 minute of silent meditation with them. And, some of the kids were giggling or talking through the thing, and it didn't work great. And so then two male counselors, one who's in the Navy, and one of them who looks like he could be in the Navy or Army or something, I've not done camp with either of them before, and they get up and they just present this big white macho male authority, you will not do that type of a thing. And I was just like, this is not church camp. Like, we don't make threats, you know. And so in processing that with people is like, I'm like, yes, there was a need to address behavior, but if we get compliance because we're threatening kids, that you know that's not what we're after. We want compliance because they have decided to participate. We want it to come from an internal force inside of them. We want to lure them, to persuade them, um, to participate in ways that are helpful with everybody, and not to just threaten and scare them not to do it. Like, that's the way I think about all of religion. But here was a concrete, specific little example at church camp. And so, I got up on the third day, when I was leading worship. We were going to have a 5 minute silent meditation. And I said, I'm going to ask the counselors if there's noise, not to like do a lot of shh, or not to go whack anybody, or not, I said, I just invite all of you. I said, there's, with the adults, there's 90 of us in this room, right? If we're all trying to make a lot of noise, and 87 people make a lot of noise and 3 people don't participate and are silent, there's still a lot of noise. It works. It doesn't ruin the experience for anybody. But if we're trying to have 5 minutes of silent meditation and 3 people are talking loudly or goofing off, it ruins the experience for everybody. So it just takes one person to ruin an experience like that. I invite you to all be with us. We had 5 minutes of silent meditation. All of the adults were stunned. I managed to barely refrain from saying, I can't believe you guys just did that, because that would be projecting negativity onto them. So I said, thank you. Several kids afterwards said we could have gone on another 5 or 10 minutes. That was wonderful. It was so peaceful. To me, if we're ever going to get there as humanity, we're going to get there because we persuade each other to be loving, not because we threaten each other to behave well. So that, my notion of God is not a controlling God. I never say God controls everything. I never say God is in charge. I never say God is all powerful. I believe in the power of love, and I believe that love is from God, and God is love, and love is God, and therefore I believe in the power of God from love and from persuasion. but not from some kind of coercive power. And so for me, this allows me and most disciples, if not specifically process theologians, most disciples are more open to interfaith relationships and more affirming of other faiths, and most of us are not going to be condemning of people of other religions because we think along these lines. But for me to have a way where I could explain to myself and other people who Jesus is, um, who God is, what that relationship is, how I want to follow Jesus, and yet not have any part of that understanding be a put down of anybody of another tradition or an atheist or anything, then that saved Christianity for me. I would not be able to be a Christian if I had not come to some kind of realization like that. And I think my dad had it, but not necessarily in those exact words, but the spirit. So I grew up with the spirit. My dad was a disciples preacher. I grew up with that spirit of openness and inclusiveness. I just hadn't found a way to articulate it for myself in a way that I thought was legitimate as far as the Bible went and as far as theologians went, and seemed rational and something that I could believe. Uh, Doug, let's give anybody else a chance, and if not, then we'll come back to you.
So I'd like to interject a question, if I might. So I'm a sociologist by training, and so much of what you had said, as far as the perspective of there's not a superiority of one religion over another, reminded me of ethnocentrism versus and ethno-relativity. And so when you have encountered someone who is very devout and committed to their respective faith, and they challenge your ideology as far as there is not a superior faith, how do you use process Christology to be persuasive so that they maybe have had a seed planted that will eventually grow and kind of be respectful of others' faiths?
So do you have in mind, when you say a devout follower of faith, do you have in mind like a fundamentalist Christian, or do you have in mind a Jewish person or anybody? Because I'd probably respond to that question differently depending on who and where it's coming from.
I mean, it could be anyone from, say, the Abrahamic tier of religion, where their particular sect, say within Christianity or within Judaism or within Islam, that's what they have been taught, and that's what they're very devoted to, and they maybe have not considered, how to be more ethno-relative or culturally relative and respectful, and stand in someone else's shoes,
Mm-hmm.
so that they can, understand that probably everybody has, a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help?
Yeah, and it depends on the relationship and all of that, but I would sometimes I find myself trying to persuade them to be more ethno-relative, to use your term, more open-minded, more inclusive, more, willing to meet people without judging them. At my best, I think it's less that I'm trying to persuade them to be that way, because again, that's me trying to convert them into my way of thinking. And so I try to be more sharing where I came from and what my journey was to get to where I am now. And as Doug has, I think, frequently mentioned, or taught me, like, it's hard to argue with somebody's story. You can argue with their theology, you can argue with their opinions, but if they tell you their story, like, it's their story. Like, how do you argue? No, you did not experience that. Um, I mean, you can say, well, no, you interpreted that wrongly. And, sometimes I'm like, I mean, maybe I did, but this is how I'm interpreting it now. This is, sometimes it ends up with me just saying, well, you might be right. It's a little hard to argue with that. Like you might be right. Um, right. I mean, I might not be right, but this is where I am right now. And what I would say is, like, the one thing I don't want anybody is to pretend that they believe something when they really don't, but I'm putting so much pressure on them because I'm their pastor and I'm telling them what they have to believe, because then that creates like a dissociation within who they are, and I want people to be whole and integrated selves. So I don't want to, I mean, I can tell them why I believe what I can believe. I could say why Orthodox Christianity has led to this, but I'm like, but until it makes sense to you, I don't want you to pretend that you believe it. I want you to keep asking questions. And so often that plants seeds, I mean, seldom, if somebody's very ethnocentric, seldom do they change through one conversation, right? So it's, do I stay in relationship? Are they willing to stay in relationship with me? If so, then there's enough curiosity there that, who knows, 20 years from now, uh, or maybe their kids a generation or two from now, there's less ethnocentricity there than there was before. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. Appreciate that.
I mean, I will confess that I kind of wish I could wave my magic wand and make everybody be more ethno-relative and open-minded and caring about others, and but in the world that we live in, I don't have a magic wand. And um, another thing I wanted to say is I was blessed and grateful that we had several inner faith couples that were members of the church I pastored in Nashville, Tennessee. So there were several times where a Christian married a Jew, and some couples, they just go to separate churches, but usually the spouse at one point or the other says, hey, I'm singing this big piece in the choir. Would you come, just not to be converted, but just to hear me sing? And then they will, and so that would happen, and then the person would come and have an experience, and would come up and, I didn't hear anything in this whole service that made me feel excluded or like I was wrong or like I was being judged, and I want to thank you for that. And I said, I hope you never do, and if you do, please, I want you to come talk to me about it, because it's not intentional. And so some of them became, I mean, almost every Sunday, we had two or three Jews as part of our worship service that felt like, and they would do our church mission projects. And when we would welcome the homeless, they would be there. They were a part of the church community. They just never, they didn't take communion. They were welcome to take communion on our end, but they usually chose not to. Some of them did, but usually they chose not to. But it was just a blessing, to get that kind of confirmation that we're not, what we're hearing here does not feel painful or hateful to us in any way. Now, there would be Christian pastors that would hear what I just said and say that's the problem, but I'm not one of them.
Shall we go back to Doug's question?
Sure.
Well, Jay, that one of my big passions, besides storytelling, is environmental and earth care. And there's this theology that says that the earth is given to human beings by God to use and abuse as we choose. And it's okay. God is going to burn up the earth anyway, so we may as well take advantage of this time, and God's going to rescue us from the earth. I don't hear process theologians thinking in that way at all. So Sally McFaig was one of your teachers, and she was a strong um, environmentalist. Could you say something about process theology and earth care?
I think it lines up well with Earth Care. I'm trying to think if I've read anything particularly about. I'm sure there is. Um, One of my favorite books on process theology. There's two that are like really easy access. And Michelle, I don't know if you can take notes of these and put them in the chat, but one of them is by Marjorie Suhaki. It's a little book called In God's Presence, and it's a book on prayer. And she starts by kind of like, before you think about prayer, you have to think about what you're praying to or who you're praying to. And so it's kind of an exploration of who God is and then how prayer works. And one of the things that she says is God works with the world the way it is to help lead it towards what it can become. So, God can't do magic. God works with the world the way it is, tries to lead it to what it can become. And then she says, prayer changes the way the world is, and therefore changes what it can become. And then the most simple way that is if I am praying for the well-being of the earth, the world is different because I am different, because I am much more conscious of the way I walk on the earth than I would be if I was not bringing it to my mind and not praying about it. And therefore that changes a little bit what God can do, right? I mean, that's one of me, but the more of us that are involved, the more of us that pray for the world, the more it can change what God can do for the world. So that book is called In God's Presence. Um, she starts with this just delightful thing. She's like, presumably God being the God of the universe, um, is really busy, but then God being the God of the universe like has this ability. So God can be available for me to talk to anytime, but sometimes because I get all distracted, I make appointments with God, not because God needs them, but because I need them. And it's playful the way that she talks about God in there. The other book that I love is by a man named Robert Brizzi, Brizee, and the title of it is Eight Paths to Forgiveness. And Brizzi, he comes up with given the process theology, what does forgiveness mean? What is forgiveness? So chapter 1 is a theology of forgiveness from a process perspective. And then he says a theology is only theory unless it works in practice. So what would this look like? So the next 8 chapters are 8 different stories of something that happened where forgiveness might come into play. And what does forgiveness from a process perspective look like? And Doug, this is a very roundabout way of trying to pretend like I'm answering your question. But there may well be one of those 8 stories that has to do with environmental, forgiveness of what's going on a planet level. I am not certain, but that's the only thing I can think of that I might have read that has to do with it. So one of his examples is, the title is "But She Broke Her Vow," and the chapter is told from the story of an Italian man who owns a family restaurant in the town that he grew up in. And he went off to college and met his wife, and they got married, and they moved back to his family town where he knew everybody, and they ran the family restaurant business. So he's busy all the time, and when he has a day off, he's going over to his brother's house to help fix the roof, or going over to his sister's house to help do this. And she feels lost, and she tries to tell him about it, and he doesn't hear. And after years of this, she finally files for divorce, and he's just livid. And but she promised to be with me forever. And and so it asks the question, what does forgiveness look like in this story? And then so they talk through what forgiveness is and what it isn't. And it's not just letting people get away with treating you badly. It's you have to be safe before you can even begin to think about forgiveness. Because there's another one where there's an abusive situation. It's like, you don't go back to somebody, you don't forgive them by going back to them. You get safe And his idea is kind of like forgiveness is willing the well-being of the other person. It doesn't mean you have to be around them, but you get to a point of forgiveness when you stop wanting them to die a horrible and painful death and want them to grow and develop in the best way possible for them, even if it's not around you. One of the stories is about two teenage boys who were playing with matches in the woods and started a fire, and there was a great forest fire, and it burned down whole neighborhoods. How does that community of people who lost their homes forgive these two teenage boys? What does that look like? So it's not like there are no consequences. So that story, there may be others in there that have to do with environmental issues. I just can't remember for sure. Other than that, certainly Sally McFaig and Body of God and her whole conception of the earth as God's body, which is just I'd say earth-shattering concept, but it's probably not the best adjective to use. But to think about what we are doing to the earth, we are doing to God's body, has profound theological implications. But all that, and you ask about process theology, and again, I do not mean to be presenting myself as the expert on process theology, because now I've been asked two questions that I've been horribly unqualified to answer. But the title of this was Process Christology and not just process theology, right? So Christology is examining the question of who Jesus is, and to what degree is Jesus a human being, and to what degree is Jesus God. And that's one thing I want to come back to. This is the way that I put it that made sense to me, when I felt like that Jesus was every bit as human being as you as I was. No special powers, no, I mean, because if Jesus had special powers and didn't have to go to the bathroom and didn't get hungry and stuff like that, then how do I model my life on him? Because I don't have those special powers. Like that, as a kid, that never made any sense to me. If he's God, how can I try to be like him? But so I came to believe that Jesus was just like us, but more open to God's will than we are. And so the way I put it is, Jesus is not qualitatively different than us, but Jesus is quantitatively different than us. And that the percentage of his openness to God is so much higher than my openness to God, that he's quantitatively different, and he's so open to God that to look at Jesus is kind of to look at what God would look like if God were a human being, which is almost orthodox, who believes that Jesus is God in the flesh. And in ways I'm not really denying that, but I'm explaining it in a way that worked for me, that it's not that Jesus is qualitatively different than us, but enough quantitatively different than us that it put him in a whole new category compared to me. But to me, it also leaves room for Muhammad or the Buddha or a number of other people to also be significantly quantitatively different than me, that I can learn from them.
So with what you just said, so would Jesus have no shield, or just more holes in the shield to allow the arrows through?
So this is where I don't want to dictate what any person believes. As I said, there's the story of Jesus and the Canaanite woman, where in case not everybody's familiar with it, this woman comes where Jesus is eating dinner, and she asks to be healed, or asks for her child to be healed. It's in two different gospels, and Jesus says, "I was sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." I was sent to take care of Jewish people. You're not. You're a Samaritan. You're a Canaanite. You're a Gentile. It's not fair to give the children's food to the dogs. there are all kinds of Christian apologetics for how Jesus was just testing her faith. All the people that want to take the Bible literally do not take that phrase literally. Because to call a woman a female dog, not the greatest thing to do, right? And so she pushes back and she says, yes, but even the dogs eat the scraps from under the table. Kind of like, I'm not asking to be included with all the Jewish children and all of you. I just want the little bit of leftovers that will cure me or cure my child. And then Jesus says, woman, great is your faith, go forth and be healed. To me, that story reads of Jesus having a bias, a cultural bias that he had grown up in because he grew up in a culture. And all cultures have biases. And that to me, that's a biblical story of Jesus having a cultural bias, being called on it, and getting it. It doesn't quite like, I'm so sorry, that was so rude of me, go forth and be healed. But it almost reads a little bit that way to me. And so to me, Jesus has a membrane just like us. It's just extraordinarily porous. But that's one story in the Bible where you kind of hear it, think, whoops, that one didn't get through the first time, but then the second one that comes just a couple seconds later gets through. And you never hear after that Jesus being exclusive, for the rest of the gospel. You never hear that after that. And then the Jesus movement becomes, there's always that tension between Peter and Paul, between those that are open and those that are not open. And that's what most of the New Testament is, this inner argument. People think the Bible says this. Well, the Bible is an argument with itself on whether to be inclusive or whether not to be inclusive. And I think we see that one little moment where Jesus is exclusive for a moment and then gets it. So that's how I answer the question personally. But if somebody wants to say, well, Jesus doesn't have a membrane and he was fully God, I'm like, I will throw out the Jesus and the Canaanite woman story, and it's like, that's why I am the way, think the way I think. But if you don't, that's okay with me. You can live with that story for a while and see if it says anything different to you. And if it doesn't, I'm not going to fight that. Karen.
Again, what you're saying reminds me so much of Islam, because we believe that Prophet Muhammad, was so much more special than most of us. That, he was, like you said, let a lot of the arrows in. He heard what God had to say and was teaching people, but he wasn't, he did make mistakes once in a while. And usually God would correct him. And that was a lesson in itself. So it's interesting to hear how you are believing so much of the same things that we believe.
Mm. Mm. And for me to follow a Jesus who was amazing but not perfect makes a lot more sense than to follow one who was divine and perfect and therefore I can't be anything like. And that's why out of all the titles for Jesus in the Bible, my favorite is found in Hebrews chapter 12, where it's, therefore we run the race with perseverance, looking to Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. So a pioneer goes out and bushwhacks the trail, and other people follow that trail, and it's easier for them to get to where they want to go. It's easier for them to get through the forest because Jesus went first as the pioneer, not as someone totally different, but as someone like us, but who led the way. And I think it also, one of the sticking points between Jews and Christians has always been the claim that Jesus is God. And so, my fully human and mostly like what God would be as a human being, I think works with it works okay with Jewish theology for the most part, making, because Jesus is a Jewish man and a Jewish teacher throughout his whole life until the day he dies. Now, you'd have to have a Jewish theologian say whether they buy that or not, but to me, it's a much more of a compatible theology. I think we're running short on time. Anybody that hasn't spoken or asked or commented want to?
So, if you don't mind, one last question. Many Christians support the ideology of the Trinity. And so you've spoken about God and Jesus, but what about the Trinity as a whole?
Oh, that's a fabulous question. I would say most of my life I was very resistant to being told I had to believe the doctrine of the Trinity, because I had, to me, there was God and there was Jesus, and Jesus prayed to God. Jesus called God Father. Jesus says, "Why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone." I mean, most of the Gospels have Jesus distinguishing himself from God. So I'm like, you know, so I struggle with that. But not long ago, a couple of years ago, I was working on my dissertation at Lexington and read this like Greek Orthodox theologian, John Zizioulas, and then some Catholic theologians, and they talked about, what if we picture God not as a singularity but as a relationship? What if the fundamental nature of life is relationship and not individuality? And that kind of started to blow my mind. And then I thought about like family systems theory, that Murray Bowen and then Edwin Friedman brought into the church circles, with the idea that the individual is not the main building block of society, but the family unit is. And you can't understand any individual person outside of what their family culture was when they grew up and how that shaped them. And so that relationship, without understanding of the Trinity, and that we are made for relationship, that made sense to me. Now, what does this mean for Jesus? Sometimes we distinguish between Jesus, the human being that walked the earth, and the Christ, the embodiment of God. And so there are those who feel like that Christ is pre-existent, that the Christ as an embodiment of God in some way always existed, and that the Christ kind of is maybe the will of God or the word of God that tries to get into all of us and bounces off a membrane, or we could all be Christs, but that Jesus was so open that we can call him Jesus the Christ, the anointed one, And so when I think of the Trinity and I think of a second person of the Trinity, I think of it as the Word made flesh that, maybe happened to the greatest degree in Jesus, but that happens to some degree in all of us. The Imago Dei that is planted in all, the image of God that is in all of us, the light of God that is in all of us. So that's how I work with that with the Trinity. I love the idea of a primordial relationship, and that Jesus is kind of like the Christ and the Spirit filling in the human of Jesus. But the Trinity was not like God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. It's God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit. And Christ and Jesus are not necessarily exclusively synonymous. I might get a B plus on a paper if I turn that into divinity school. So I'm sure professional theologians would poke holes in that, but it works for me.
Well, and I thank you for answering it. So yeah, I just was kind of curious where that actually fit in. So it is actually 7:30, and we want to extend our sincere appreciation to you, Dr. Hartley, for spending a very engaging hour, and very illuminating for all of us, and sharing some really fascinating resources as well. I did put the books that you referenced in the chat. even though Amazon, yields a few hisses these days, there's still a good source to actually see what something is about. And then you can choose to peruse how you actually follow up on acquiring something of that nature.
Probably both of those books are available from the Center for Process Studies
Okay.
website. It probably would cost a little more and take a little longer to get to you than ordering it from Amazon, but I imagine that they would appreciate sales from the Center for Process Studies
Yes, thank
website.
you. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, because I know we need to have as many choices these days as what are out there instead of our often default to the easiest. So thank you. It has been a real pleasure tonight. I do want to share one last time the registration link for the youth interfaith iftar that's happening on next week. So if you have that, and I thank you all for coming. As always, I extend my sincere appreciation to Asra and Joe for coordinating these very engaging evenings. And thank you so much again, Dr. Hartley, for really stimulating presentation. So all the best to all of you.